Every empire believes its debts are different, that this time the rules of history don't apply. Rome believed it, France believed it, and now America believes it too. But history keeps the receipts, and every number written in red ink eventually demands to be paid. $300 trillion. That's not just debt. That's the lifeblood of the global system. It fuels governments, corporations, wars, and dreams. It's the invisible currency of power, and the quiet reason every crisis feels inevitable. Yet no one really asks, what happens when the system built on debt runs out of trust? Because that's what debt truly is. Not money owed, but belief borrowed. A promise that tomorrow will always be richer than today. And every empire, from Caesar's Rome to the United States of America, has believed that promise, until one day, it couldn't. When Rome began diluting its silver coins, people didn't call it collapse. They called it policy. When France printed its way out of revolution, they called it recovery. When modern America expands its balance sheet by trillions overnight, they call it stimulus. But the pattern never lies. Each borrowed boom ends the same way, with inflation, devaluation, and the quiet erosion of everything that money once meant. Today, that pattern has reached its breaking point. Global debt, across households, corporations, and governments, now exceeds $300 trillion. That's more than 3 times the world's total economic output. And yet, the solution from every central bank sounds hauntingly familiar. Borrow more. Interest rates rise, growth slows, and still, debt climbs higher. America's national debt alone has crossed $35 trillion, growing faster than its own economy. Corporate leverage sits at historic highs. Credit card balances hit records every quarter, and households, once the backbone of prosperity, are now trapped in survival borrowing, financing the illusion of stability with tomorrow's wages. But what if this isn't just an economic problem? What if it's the mathematical endpoint of the empire itself? Because the pattern has appeared before. Every time power grows faster than productivity, and promises expand faster than reality. The Romans did it with silver. The British did it with colonies. We're doing it with credit. And beneath the surface of this global machine lies a truth no politician dares to speak. Every dollar of growth now requires more debt than the one before. The system isn't repairing itself. It's accelerating towards something. A moment of reckoning. A breaking point. A reset. This is not just a story about economics. It's about how civilizations end, slowly at first, then all at once. And how the very tool that built modern power may now be the one that destroys it. Welcome to the $300 trillion trap. The hidden equation behind the next global crisis. Debt didn't begin as a mistake. It began as a miracle. In the earliest civilizations, Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, money wasn't gold or coins. It was credit. Clay tablets recorded promises between farmers, traders, and kings. I owe you grain. I owe you silver. I owe you obedience. Debt was civilization's first technology, the invisible glue that let strangers cooperate. But from the beginning, it carried a curse. When promises outgrew production, collapse followed. Around 2400 BC in ancient Mesopotamia, kings had to declare debt jubilees. They wiped the slate clean, canceled all debts, because society itself was tearing apart. Peasants were being sold into slavery to repay loans. Land was being concentrated in fewer hands. Sound familiar? Every few generations, rulers hit the same limit, where mathematics met morality, and each time the solution was the same: forgiveness or failure. Fast forward to Rome, the empire that mastered debt as a weapon. Legions were financed with borrowed silver. Infrastructure, temples, and conquest, all funded on promises of tomorrow's tribute. As long as expansion continued, the equation worked. But when expansion stopped, interest began to eat the empire alive. By the 3rd century AD, Rome's coins, once pure silver, were mostly copper. The state diluted its money to pay its debts. Prices soared. Confidence collapsed. The Emperor Diocletian tried to freeze prices by law. It didn't work. Because debt doesn't obey decrees. It obeys gravity. That same pattern re-emerged 1,000 years later in France. In 1790, the revolutionary government printed paper money called assignats to pay war debts. They promised it was backed by land. People believed. For a while. Then came inflation, distrust, and chaos. By 1796, the French franc lost nearly 99% of its value. The printing presses were smashed in the streets by angry mobs. Every time a nation believed it could borrow its way to safety, history issued the same verdict. Debt, when small, is a servant. Debt, when massive, becomes a master. And as empires grew richer, so did their dependence on that invisible engine. Debt didn't just finance power. It became the source of it. The British Empire built its navy with borrowed gold. The American Empire built its dollar with borrowed trust. Each debt-fueled century looked unstoppable, until the math stopped working. But here's the twist. Unlike Rome or France, modern finance found a way to hide the danger. By spreading it, by globalizing it, by making everyone, every bank, every citizen, every government, a shareholder in the illusion. And that illusion is what we call the global economy. It looks stable. It feels modern. But beneath it, the oldest force in history is ticking. The compounding pressure of debt. And when that pressure breaks, it never asks for permission. Every age tells itself the same lie. This time is different. But every empire that tried to outrun debt eventually ran out of road. Let's trace the pattern. Not through philosophy, but through history's financial wreckage. Case 1. The British Empire. At its height in the 19th century, Britain ruled a quarter of the world. The sun never set on its territories, but it did set on its balance sheet. Between 1793 and 1815, during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's national debt exploded from 243 million to over 900 million. That's more than 200% of GDP, the highest in its history. The empire borrowed to fight, borrowed to build, borrowed to rule. But after the wars ended, so did the illusion of infinite growth. The interest payments alone consumed half the government's revenue. Debt didn't just fund power, it controlled it. Britain had to tax its colonies, squeeze its trade routes, and rely on opium exports to balance its books. Debt drove conquest, and conquest drove collapse. By 1945, the empire that once owned the seas was drowning in its own obligations. Case 2. The United States. The modern heir to empire. In 1945, America emerged from World War II as the world's creditor. It was the banker of the planet. Foreign nations owed Washington over $40 billion, a fortune at the time. The US dollar was as good as gold, but something changed. By 1971, America owed more than it owned. President Nixon closed the gold window, ending the dollar's link to gold, because the debts were too large to pay. It was a silent default, disguised as innovation. The result? A new world order built not on metal, but on faith. Faith that debt itself could be money. From that moment, every crisis, every war, every bailout, every stimulus was financed by creating new IOUs. By 2008, that system cracked. Subprime mortgages, derivatives, and reckless speculation imploded. The global financial system froze. The U.S. government responded with $700 billion in direct bailouts, plus trillions more from the Federal Reserve. And just like Rome, the pattern repeated. Debt solved the crisis by creating a bigger one. Case 3. Japan. The silent warning. After its 1980s boom, Japan faced a property collapse so large it wiped out decades of wealth. The government responded with low rates, bailouts, and endless stimulus. That was 30 years ago. Today, Japan's national debt stands at over 260% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. And yet, its economy remains stagnant, a living museum of what happens when debt never dies, it just sleeps. Case 4. The global cycle. Every nation, from China to Europe, has followed the same formula. Borrow to grow, print to survive, repeat to forget. But there's one truth they all share. Debt doesn't vanish. It just transfers. From private to public, from governments to central banks, from the future to the present. That's how every empire keeps its lights on, by stealing time. But history shows that stolen time always runs out. And today, the world has borrowed more of it than ever before. We're standing on the edge of a $300 trillion global debt mountain. A number so vast, it's almost meaningless. Until it isn't. Because numbers don't lie. And the pattern has already returned. It's no longer ancient history. The empire drowning in debt is ours. For decades, America has lived inside a financial illusion. A system powered by credit, confidence, and carefully managed chaos. But behind the headlines, the numbers have become apocalyptic. As of 2025, the United States' total debt, government, corporate, and household combined, has surpassed $100 trillion. Globally, over 300 trillion. That's nearly 3 times the size of the entire world economy. Every dollar in existence now carries a shadow, a debt that someone, somewhere, owes. And the engine that once created prosperity is now overheating. In the early 2000s, it was housing. In 2008, that bubble burst, nearly collapsing the global financial order. But instead of reform, the world doubled down. Debt became the cure for debt. Low interest rates became life support. Governments borrowed to fund recovery. Corporations borrowed to buy back their own stock. Consumers borrowed just to keep up with the cost of living. By 2020, when the pandemic hit, the response was unprecedented. Over $16 trillion in new liquidity was injected globally. And once again, it worked for a while. Markets soared. Tech boomed. Everyone felt richer. But what happens when free money ends? In 2022, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates to fight inflation, the first real tightening in over a decade. Debt that was once cheap suddenly became poison. Mortgage rates doubled. Corporate defaults surged. Banks that had gorged on long-term bonds, like Silicon Valley Bank, imploded in days. And when they did, the response was familiar. The government guaranteed every deposit. The Fed quietly created new emergency lending programs. Trillions of dollars appeared again, conjured from thin air. But this time, it wasn't called a bailout. They called it a backstop, a softer word for the same old rescue. And just like that, the cycle repeated. Crisis, panic, printing, relief. Only now, it's happening faster. The danger isn't just the debt itself. It's what it represents. Every borrowed dollar is a promise about the future, a promise that growth will continue, that productivity will rise, that confidence will last. But what happens when the promises outnumber the real wealth? You get an economy built on leverage, not labor, speculation, not stability, and a government forced to borrow, just to pay interest on what it already owes. By 2030, U.S. interest payments alone could surpass $1.5 trillion a year, more than the defense budget. That's not just unsustainable. It's mathematical doom. And yet, the same story plays out on every screen, every cycle. Markets rally, politicians reassure, central banks print. But history whispers, so did Rome. So did France. So did Weimar Germany, until the faith broke. And once faith breaks, no empire can buy it back. Because every currency, every market, every nation built on debt eventually meets its reckoning. And America, the richest debtor in human history, is running out of time. Act 4. The warning. When the engine stops, there's a moment in every empire's story when the engine that once fueled greatness begins to devour itself. For America, that engine is debt. For decades, it powered expansion, innovation, dominance. But today, it's running on fumes. And when a debt-driven system slows down, it doesn't land softly. It collapses. The warning signs are no longer subtle. Inflation may have cooled, but prices remain 20 to 30% higher than before the pandemic. Real wages haven't caught up. Credit card debt has crossed $1.3 trillion, the highest in U.S. history. Default rates are rising, especially among young borrowers. Corporate bankruptcies in 2024 surged over 60% compared to the previous year. Small businesses are suffocating under higher interest costs, and government deficits are ballooning, even during peacetime and prosperity. That's not a cycle of growth. It's a spiral of desperation. Every empire in history faced this moment. Rome minted bronze coins to pay its soldiers. France printed assignments to rebuild after the revolution. Weimar Germany flooded its economy with marks until people carried cash in wheelbarrows. Each time, the leaders promised. This time, it's different. Each time, they were wrong. Today, America is repeating the same illusion. With digital precision, every crisis is met with the same reflex. Print, borrow, repeat. It's not just economics anymore. It's survival through illusion. But illusions have consequences. When confidence breaks, even the strongest currency burns like paper. When people lose faith in money itself, they look elsewhere. Gold, land, Bitcoin, anything real. And that shift is already beginning. Foreign nations are quietly reducing their U.S. debt holdings. China, once the largest buyer of American bonds, is stepping away. Even U.S. allies are building alternatives, trade deals, reserve currencies, digital systems, designed to outlive the dollar's dominance. The next crisis won't start with a bang. It will start with a pause. When someone, somewhere, refuses to buy the next round of debt, when yields spike, when the Treasury's auctions fail, when confidence flickers, and then the machine will seize, not because the math changed, but because belief did. The $300 trillion global debt trap isn't just an accounting problem. It's a civilization-scale reckoning. Because when you borrow the future to survive the present, eventually, the future arrives. The question isn't if this system resets. The question is who controls it when it does. Some whisper of soft landings and orderly transitions. History calls that denial. The truth? Debt-based empires don't fade quietly. They reset violently. Currencies collapse, governments fall, and power realigns. And every sign, every chart, every bond, every budget says the fuse is already lit. Act 5. Conclusion. The lesson of history and the cliffhanger: every empire writes its obituary in numbers. Not in blood, not in war, but in debt. Rome did it in silver. France did it on paper. And now, America is doing it in code. The $300 trillion global debt isn't just an economic statistic. It's a mirror, a reflection of humanity's oldest addiction: growth at any cost. We've built skyscrapers on borrowed time, stock markets on borrowed confidence, and governments on borrowed money. And for a while, it works. Debt feels like power, until it demands repayment. Look at the pattern through the lens of history. First, debt fuels prosperity. Then, prosperity turns to arrogance. Then, arrogance to fragility. And finally, collapse. It's the same sequence, whether in the marble halls of Rome, the streets of Weimar, or the trading floors of Wall Street. The variable changes. The equation never does. In 1907, it was panic. In 1929, depression. In 2008, the Great Recession. And today, a quiet tightening. A tightening that feels less like crisis and more like compression before the break. The danger this time isn't chaos, it's control. The digital age has given governments and central banks something no empire ever had before: the ability to monitor and manipulate debt in real time. Digital currencies, programmable money, algorithmic interest rates, a system that can rewrite its own rules to survive, at the cost of your freedom to opt out. When the reset comes, it won't look like the Weimar wheelbarrows or the Roman mints. It'll look like a software update, a solution designed to stabilize the economy and centralize power. That's how empires evolve before they end. They don't die in fire. They fade into control, and history's warning is clear. When money stops being free, people stop being free. But here's the paradox. Collapse isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's transformation. Rome's fall gave birth to Europe. Weimar's collapse gave rise to a new order. Each ending rewrites civilization's code. So the real question isn't, will the debt engine fail? It's what replaces it when it does. A freer world built on trust? Or a digital empire built on control? The cycle is repeating, right now, in real time. You can feel it. Every price, every loan, every policy speech. It's all part of the countdown. The next financial reset won't be a surprise. It'll be a pattern completing itself. Because history doesn't break the cycle. People do. And if you've seen the pattern, you already know what's coming. This is the debt trap, the engine of prosperity, and the fuse of collapse. Stay curious, stay awake, and remember, the most dangerous bubbles aren't made of money. They're made of denial. If this opened your eyes to how debt quietly shapes history, subscribe, because the next chapter isn't written yet, and you'll want to see how it begins.